On the phone, I have want to welcome to the program Rebecca Traister. She is a writer with Salon.com, author of a forthcoming book on unmarried women. Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Now, you were one of those people I saw tweeting last night into the wee hours of, or I guess the wee hours of the morning, as it were.
Oh, yes. Quite far into the morning, yes.
What was taking place yesterday? I mean, of course, we'll touch on the implications of DOMA and Proposition 8. But what happened last night, you were just saying before we got on air, was in many respects completely unexpected. Tell us, I mean, obviously the story goes back a couple of years in Texas because we've seen quite a bit about, but just sort of recount to us what's been happening in Texas in terms of the right of a woman to have some measure of sovereignty over her own body.
Well, the things that have been happening in Texas in terms of state law actually are like what's been happening in many states around the country. Individual state legislatures are trying to pass an array of different kinds of laws that essentially make abortion and reproductive care impossible for the women within that given state to get through one way or another. And in Texas's case, also, like many other states around the country, they were doing a bunch of things with this law that was it was a House bill, and then what was being debated last night was a Senate bill. What was being filibustered last night was a state Senate bill, and it was a 20-week abortion ban, which would be across the board. It was also a ban that had all kinds of requirements about abortion facilities that basically would have been impossible for Texas's current 42 abortion facilities to rise to these new requirements, and it would force the shutdown of 37 of them, which of course makes, as soon as you limit women's access to getting the reproductive care that they need and to getting abortions, you basically make it impossible for them to get those abortions. You're essentially undoing the work of Roe v. Wade. You're preventing Americans. You're preventing women from getting the procedures that they have a right to get in this country that are legal procedures.
When you talk about a state the size of Texas, and you talk about 5 clinics that provide abortion services, I mean, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you would put up more obstacles to people having access to those procedures, and that was clearly, obviously, the intent of this bill, right? I mean, there's no body of evidence that suggests that the requirements that they were placing on these clinics were necessary from a medical standpoint or a public safety standpoint.
None. To the contrary, what it does is shut down healthcare, safe, legal healthcare for millions of women. It is absolutely a detriment to women's health. Of course, proponents for the bill argued for it mostly by claiming that this was about setting up higher safety standards for women and providing safer care. But one of the points that I think Wendy Davis, who is the state senator who did this remarkable filibuster yesterday, one of the points that she made that I very much appreciated her making yesterday, abortion facilities, like medical facilities around the country, and perhaps even more, are so highly regulated already because they're such a political issue. And this kind of concern for we need to have the highest standards of medical health, they're not being applied to facilities that do not only sort of everything from dental procedures and vasectomies to actually live births. Right. We're not asking that hospitals that perform live births, which, by the way, compared to early abortion procedures are very dangerous, we're not asking that those facilities meet these impossible requirements that will force them to shut down. These are very special sets of too high standards, which are designed to make it impossible for these facilities to remain open.
Rebecca, before we go into the drama of the filibuster yesterday, because it really was an amazingly dramatic event that at one point there were, I think, 175,000 people watching live on YouTube.
And not just any point, in the middle of the night.
At midnight, indeed. But before we go there, I mean, let me ask you this. When we talk about these restrictions, right, I mean, we all know why they're being promoted in terms of those who want to see these restrictions promoted. We know that audience. That audience wants to see abortion outlawed. They want to see essentially women told they must basically force pregnancies for women. Those
Yes.
of us who can point out, like you've just done, and with an assist from Wendy Davis, that we don't see these type of regulations on any other type of medical procedure, ones that are demonstrably more dangerous to the health of everyone who participates in those. So this is clearly for that purpose. Why is there this kabuki? I
You
mean,
mean on the kabuki on which part? Why is this presented as for the benefit of
indeed.
women's health?
Yes. For whose benefit is that kabuki theater? I mean, it seems like people are pretty well aware of what's going on here. Either they agree with it or they disagree with it. Why this kabuki?
Well, I think that it's a lot more attractive to say that you're doing this for the benefit of women's health than it is, and which is what many of the bill's proponents say. And it also takes this kind of, even this defense takes this kind of protectionist, paternalistic air. It was really, it was very startling yesterday to listen to the bill's proponents talk about how basically they're just trying to protect the helpless women of Texas. Even the disguised arguments about how much these lawmakers want to help women are pretty repulsive in their own right in terms of their condescension, protectionism, and paternalism. But it is certainly more attractive, and these lawmakers know it, to say that they're fighting on behalf of women's health and safety, and the more common argument, which is that they're fighting on behalf of the unborn,
right?
And for fetal rights, and in fact are prizing fetal rights at higher than women's rights. But all that is more attractive than saying what often feels closer to the truth, which is that the fight is actually about policing and patrolling women's reproductive lives and their sexual lives, and the way they conduct themselves as independent adults. And that doesn't sound so good in political theater, to say, I'd like to continue to control your body and what you do with it, both sexually and reproductively, which in turn has an impact on how you earn your money, how you live in this country, how your social, economic, and professional choices are all impacted by your ability to control your reproductive life. And none of that sounds particularly attractive. And I guess that the feeling is it sounds much more appealing when you say it's about helping everybody out.
Now, I want to get to the drama that took place last night, but I want to start with just to edify the point of just how sort of I just found this bizarre. We have a story of a lawmaker doing an actual talking, standing filibuster in the Texas Senate in what was an incredibly hostile environment, evidenced by what they did to attempt to end that filibuster. But I just have to note this because I just found this absolutely shocking. In the second paragraph of the New York Times write-up of this story, I'm going to quote this. I don't even know how to really sort of like absorb this. The reversal capped a remarkable day in the Texas legislature here. A petite, Fort Worth Democrat in pink sneakers staged a 10-hour-plus filibuster marathon in which she never sat down. I want people just for a moment, just to absorb just sort of the incredible sexism involved in this. What would be does anybody know what kind of shoes Rand Paul wore for those 5 hours? I mean, it's just stunning.
Well, I would like to say that that's better than an earlier New York Times story that I saw about it, in which her name wasn't mentioned until the 16th paragraph. I would like to say that was the first time story that I read this morning didn't mention the name Wendy Davis, the woman who stood up for more than 13 hours without leaning, without eating, drinking, or peeing, or even touching the podium. And her name wasn't in the initial story that I read for 16 paragraphs. So, but I do agree with you. Now, in fairness, I've written a lot about the way that women's clothing and self-presentation is covered by the media. And there is a degree. She wore pink sneakers. The sneakers were symbolic. They stood for the fact that she was going to be standing
right.
For all these hours. So I wouldn't, yes, you are absolutely right to point to it. and we should consider it.
I just think that if that's the point, then they need to contextualize that. I mean,
Yes, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you about that. And I wish, I wish that wasn't the first thing mentioned about her. Let me say that I wish it was, at the bottom paragraph where it was filling in the details. I don't think that's the most important thing that we should have gotten from yesterday's historic reversal, watched by almost 200,000 people in the middle of a Tuesday night. I don't think that the pink sneakers were probably the most important on the journalistic pyramid. But I will say, I do think that one of the things I've written about a lot in the past is when you have these women who are still anomalies. There are still so many fewer women in these governing bodies and representative bodies. And there is a way in which when you tell their stories and the stories of the actions that they're taking, their appearance, they don't look like all those who have come before them, and often they don't look like all those that they're opposing on a state Senate floor.
And there's just also such a cutesy quality of this. She was petite, and she, but
the petite was what I'm going to give it. The petite was what got me more than the shoes. She
absolutely.
wore the pink shoes. She wanted she wanted people to see the shoes.
Pink shoes, symbolic of what she was doing, is fine in my estimation. But let's leave that aside because that's the least relevant part of this story. So she is into hour, I think it was 12, at about 11 p.m. This is a special session. If she can make it to 12 a.m. to midnight, where the time will run out. They will not be able to vote on the bill. And then a fellow lawmaker, after attempting to ask her a question, get her to cede the floor, comes in with a point of parliamentary inquiry, or basically makes a claim that what she's talking about is not germane. Tell us what happened in that moment, and what that was about.
Well, there was all this tremendous political theater. Throughout the whole day, there have been various attempts to get her to violate one of these rules. There are very strict rules for how you maintain a talking filibuster in the Texas legislature, including the no leaning, no sitting, no eating, no drinking, no peeing, no touching the podium, and you had to remain on topic. And so obviously this was part of political theater. There were people who were trying to get her to screw up so that she could end her filibuster and they could vote the measure in. And at the very end, they got her on a couple of things, including the fact that she had a back brace. Somebody brought her a back brace for all that standing without any sitting or leaning. Somehow they worked that in, and then they got her on 2 points that they claimed that because she had to remain relevant to the discussion at hand. What she had done for the bulk of the day was read testimony sent to her, testimony that was not permitted in the initial discussions of the bill. And she read this testimony about the bill and about the abortion restrictions and about women's experiences with their reproductive care and health in Texas and around the country. She read all that, and at some point they claimed that her discussion of sonograms, enforced sonograms, which are part of the law, being debated and enacted in states around the country where you force women who are going to have abortions, who want to have abortions, to look at sonograms, to have sonograms against their will, to have the fetus described to them in very graphic terms by a doctor. And she was discussing sonograms, and the claim was that it did not have to do with this piece of legislation and therefore was not germane. This was a completely bogus claim, but it was part of these theatrics and really designed as a kind of a tool of trickery to get her filibuster to stop. And this was actually probably about 2 hours before she was ready before it was midnight.
And people understand that a senator rises, says to the chair, her discussion of sonograms is not germane. What happens at that point is they turn off the audio. She stays standing because she doesn't want to violate anything because they're
right.
And a bunch of Republicans huddle at the front of the chamber, presumably maybe some Democrats as well. At that point, it was, I don't know if it was still the lieutenant governor. He made the ruling, I think, essentially that what she was talking about was not germane. Therefore, the filibuster ends. He then essentially exited stage coward and put another guy to stand there and basically take the arguments, the point of inquiries that were coming as people, Democrats in particular, were trying to argue Robert's Rules of Order that it was germane, that we need to vote on whether or not it was germane, that we need to
Right.
vote after 3 so-called violations, whether or not the filibuster can end. This haggling went on for almost an hour and a half.
Yes, and then and there are very moving instances. It's really, people should go back and watch this. The Democrats who were strategically also trying to run out the clock. I mean, this was all really tremendous. It was a great view of this particular aspect of a very rare aspect of the American political process, which is a standing filibuster. And the Democrats, her allies, Wendy Davis's allies, were trying to run out the clock, including really moving questions being asked by even some pro-life, anti-abortion state senators who didn't believe in the bill because they were in support of women's health. And then there was this remarkable question asked by Letitia Vandeput.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm saying her name right. She asked a question that was very sort of Bob Dylan-esque. It was probably about 1:45 and she was trying to get herself heard, and she said, how many times does a woman have to raise her voice or her hand to be heard over the men in a representative body? And it was this wildly eloquent question that cut to the quick of so much of what we were seeing more broadly, which was, a predominantly male legislative body trying to shut down and silence women and the rights of women, and literally the voice of this woman who was filibustering. And Letitia Vandeput asked this question, and very soon after, the legislature, the floor, and all the people who'd come, all of the supporters of Wendy Davis started to shout, and they started to cheer. And it was deafening. And the Republicans were trying to call the roll before midnight to get the vote before midnight. And the cheering and the support from the crowd was so deafening and caused so much chaos that it set the whole representative body into chaos. They couldn't get the roll call called. And it went for minutes. It went for 10 minutes. It went for 15 minutes past midnight. And it was really this had been this one woman talking all day. And then she was joined by her political allies who had her back, and this State Senator Vandeput, who I believe had just come from her father's funeral. Yes. And had come to participate in this, asking this eloquent question, and then to have the participation of the crowd come in at the last moment. And even once the midnight hour had passed, once we had gotten past the part where they were no longer able to take the vote and have it count, Republican lawmakers still tried to get the vote in. They still tried to enter it into the computer, but 200,000 people had been watching. And there was no way that particular last trick could work. And it took several hours, actually, for that to be for anybody to get clear on whether or not the bill was going to pass or not. It turned out that it was effectively killed by this event yesterday. But in some senses, which is wonderful for the women of Texas, though it certainly doesn't end what will be further incursions within that state and around the country. But more than that, the protest that we saw, the effective display of power and resistance to this kind of pushing of laws through was really important and really historic.
Yeah, we just have just a couple minutes here. We're going a little bit long, but this was really dramatic, and that's what I wanted to also is to ask you is that 175,000 people. That's not in the great scheme of things. That's not that many people, but
right.
It seems to me that this was such a dramatic moment and it has all the elements of drama that you would want: heroes, villains, empowerment, like you say, both in the individual and in terms of within the establishment, the institution, and then also outside of it, literally the people in the gallery preventing this from going forward. And, for a moment, I want to put aside any cynicism I have as to whether or not the Republicans also like this drama, because maybe, it also, there's some electoral theories about whether or not they actually want to complete these type of laws in some respects. But put that aside for a moment. This, how galvanizing do you think this will be? I mean, we already have seen in many respects, particularly over the past year or two in our politics, the empowerment as a voting bloc of women, particularly single women, I think, and younger women, in a way that people have projected would happen. But now I think we're sort of seeing it realized. Where do you think this fits in that saga?
Well, I think that we're seeing our moment find its activist voice, and it happens over time. People often complain that we're living in a politically apathetic moment, but actually, if you look at the past few years, everything from the election of Barack Obama, certainly, the whole campaign, his campaign against Hillary Clinton for the primary, which was historic in so many ways, through the kinds of protests we saw in Wisconsin against Scott Walker's union busting. Now that turned out not to have been effective, and Walker won that, but the protests still meant something. The protests against the forced ultrasound bill that we saw last year, the rising up against what was called the war on women during the 2012 campaign happening across the country through states. Now this, the activism we've seen around gay marriage. Now, none of this, it's not all a rosy picture. We also are living in a time of dramatically reduced protections on our rights. Look at what happened yesterday to the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
But I do think that what we're seeing, and part of what was remarkable about last night, is we're seeing it unfold on social media and the internet. You're gaining community. It was basically like a giant protest last night. All the eyes of the world were watching, and I think it had things in common with being able to see the televised era of the civil rights era, for example, being able to see what was happening on television. And now we're able to see Texas legislature filibusters in the middle of the night, sitting at home in our computers around the world. We're finding our modes of protest in a way that I do think is very powerful, whether or not each individual battle turns out to be victorious. And when it comes to the women, yes, and I am writing a book about single women. Single women were 23% of the electorate in 2012, and they voted for Barack Obama 70% to 30%. They are a massive political force, and you could see that. Not that everybody protesting yesterday was single, and not that everybody was female, but what you see happening around women's rights is very much about an increased recognition that women have the rights to individual life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's a defense of reproductive rights that are being encroached upon every day around the country, and it is very tied up with a strengthening idea that women are independent individuals outside of their relationships to men, outside of their relationships to their husbands and their fathers, and that they have rights that do not need to be controlled by governing male bodies of any sort. And I think that was part of what we saw yesterday, too.
Yeah, Rebecca Traister, I think I appreciate your taking the time today, and I think I think it's a great point that this not only is incredibly important in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of women's continued struggle for emancipation in these areas, but also I think you're absolutely right to point out that this empowers. This has a broader implication for populist protest, regardless of the issue. And I appreciate your taking the time today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's been a remarkable few days in this country.
It certainly has.